today teaching the Watsonville Cannery Strike with primary sources. I'm Tanya Hollis, an archivist who works in the collections of the Labor Archives and Research Center at San Francisco State University. My co-presenter today are Alex Post, the Special Collections Research, Outreach, and Instruction Team Lead at SFSU, and Michelle Morton, Instruction Librarian at Cabrillo College Library. We'll be sharing two examples of how we use primary source instruction, both in Canvas and in exhibits, to support instruction at both the community college and university level.
Hi, folks. So this is our agenda for today. First, we're going to talk a little bit about the goals really that were for creating the modules and the gallery exhibits and sort of how we achieved those goals, some of the solutions. Then Michelle and I and Tanya are going to talk about how we do instruction both using the Canvas modules and the gallery exhibits. While the focus today is on the Watsonville Cannery Strike, we're also going to introduce a Canvas module on the Bracero program and its companion exhibit, The Fields of Struggle. Tanya's going to moderate a discussion between Michelle and I where we're able to share some of our thoughts on the differences between working in Canvas and then also doing instruction in an exhibit setting. Then we're going to be opening it up for a Q&A. And then finally, we're going to end the session with some faculty and student feedback from both the Canvas modules and the exhibit sessions that we've done. Next slide.
Thanks, Alex. So I'm Michelle at Cabrillo Community College. I'm the instruction librarian. And some of our goals for these projects were to support curriculum that reflects our student population. And this is kind of following, initiatives at both our colleges in curriculum and in specific departments to have more curriculum that reflects our student populations, especially as two HSIs, Hispanic Serving Institutions. Similarly, to create course materials that are relevant and meaningful to our students so they are excited about engaging with and feel like they can kind of take ownership of interpreting the materials and learning the research process. Expanding access to primary sources, connecting the local community, even outside the college, with resources and primary sources on their local history, responding to increased interest in labor history, and then for all of us working at institutions that have small staff that is getting smaller by the day, trying to figure out what is a sustainable instruction model. And this is a picture from the strike in Watsonville to the right, the cannery strike.
Oh, muted, Tanya.
So Michelle and I are old colleagues, and we had many conversations over the years, and we kind of came together with a few solutions that we thought might address a way for us to share the primary sources of the labor archives in different ways. So our first foray was to develop a Canvas module, relying on Michelle's Canvas expertise and my knowledge of primary sources in the labor archives. After we developed that, we repurposed the content. We used the digitized content to create an exhibit. We then used the same content again to develop a module. And after creating a module, we then reused our content to create a related exhibit. So it went both ways, creating multiple ways to support the faculty instruction that reinforce each other and support each other. So by presenting our content in these different mediums, we created multiple points of access for different audiences.
Will you go back one, Tanya? Thank you.
There it is. Yeah, sorry.
That's okay. So these are the modules that we've created to date, the Canvas modules. And we're going to focus, as we said, on the Watsonville Cannery Strike and the Bracero program. that have both had exhibits and Canvas modules developed. I'm just sharing the remaining ones because they are also available in Canvas Commons. So if there's anyone, if you're using Canvas at your institution, you can go to Commons and download the module, and I'll show you that in a minute. So in addition to the Watsonville Cannery Strike and the Bracero program, we did one kind of introducing what unions are, and that was a request from faculty. One on Filipino American history in Watsonville, working with the local community archive. One on a collection in the labor archives by a printer that worked a lot with unions, a printer and an artist, Giacomo Patri. One on the art of the United Farm Workers, and an oral history toolkit using Canvas. And I just want to emphasize that a big game changer for us was using the Canvas modules because they're so easy to share with faculty. And then once faculty import them into their courses, they can do what they want with them. They can adapt them and use them how they see fit, and relate them to their course. And then we can also, because in California, all three big higher education systems, the California Community College system, the California State University system, and the University of California system use Canvas for the most part. It's something that we can share, and it's a learning management system that students are familiar with and feel comfortable working in. So next slide, please. Thank you. So I just wanted to show you what this looks like in Canvas Commons. In Canvas, the left menu has that icon that you see with the kind of half circle and the arrow that links you out to Commons, where there's all kinds of stuff. And if you were to look up, for example, Watsonville Cannery Strike, you would get to this module, and that blue button on the right, you can use to download it into a course within your college, or for us, that would be our library shell within the college.
Great. So just to return to something I brought up earlier was how we repurpose content. So we went from modules to exhibits, but then we also went from exhibits to modules. Using that content from the first module we did, the Watsonville Cannery Strike, we had scanned all this material, but also Michelle had created a lot of descriptive material around it to go into the module. So we could then use that to create a physical exhibit. And that allows faculty to have a visual learning experience, especially at San Francisco State, but we also created it so it could travel. So it went to Cabrillo College as well, and it's going to other sites in that area. So it was actually a win-win, where we were able to sort of leverage all the work we did to create content in all these different formats. The second big project that we did was the Bracero program. We had actually done a 2-year digitization project from a collection. So we had all this digitized content. And part of that grant, we had written in the money to create an exhibit. So the person that did that grant curated an exhibit and then helped us use that content for a Canvas module, which we then shared to Canvas Commons. So again, just underlining, like, this allows that content to go into classrooms throughout the CSU and the CCC systems. So it's really exciting. And the exhibits have traveled, as I mentioned, to Cabrillo Library, but the Cabrillo Watsonville Campus Library, and also the Watsonville Public Library, which is really great. So we've been talking a little bit about the Watsonville Cannery Strike, and I just want to tell you all a little bit about the strike, just because it is actually one of the most underheard of strikes that happened in '85 and '87. It happened in Watsonville, California, which is, for those of you who are not in California, it's a little bit south of San Francisco, and then in a little bit east. And so it started when about 1,000 Mexican American women largely walked off the job. They called it a cannery, but it was actually a frozen food factory, where they processed food for freezing. So they went out on strike, and this was predominantly unheard of at the time, that they would go out, because their union, the Teamsters, was really entrenched and unresponsive, but they did have a contract. So they were walking out in opposition to their own union, which was a big deal. But they also went against the agribusiness machine, the politicians who were sort of in cahoots with the Teamsters. So it was a very big deal for them to go out. They were out for 18 months, which is an extraordinary amount of time to not get paid. So rather than settling early, they actually rejected a first settlement that was offered, and they pushed back and actually got less pay cuts, but one, medical benefits, seniority rights, and one, amnesty for the strikers, which was a very big deal. But out of that strike, workers really gained organizing and leadership skills, which kind of carried into the future of that community. And many of them still play a role in Watsonville today. So the Canvas module is very much like the same sort of format as what Michelle showed you earlier. What I'm looking at now is the module overview page, where we link out to all these different pages for the faculty. So you can see sort of, it gives them the ability to take any one part, but also they can follow it through the course of the strike. It's extensive. Michelle in particular put a lot of work into the content here. And we really wanted the module to focus on the strikers' point of view, rather than sort of an overview of what was happening politically. But we also include the community, which played a huge role supporting the strikers. And then also we kind of delve into the politics of the Teamsters. So there is a lot there in the Canvas module that faculty can pick and choose from. So now
Tanya, will you
sorry.
leave it here for 1 minute before you go to the next slide when you're finished? Thanks.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I'm going to let Michelle and Alex talk about their instruction now using the module, and then talk about too using exhibits. So I'm going to leave this here for Michelle.
So we're going to look at a page, but before we did that, I wanted to just look at this overview. And, we're trying to kind of give some context, talking about the different organizations that supported the strike, the conflicts within the different unions, the strikers committee. And what we're going to look at is this section that's called community support, because as Tanya said, that was such a huge factor in the success of the strike and their ability to stay out for so long. And we're going to look at the page. So there's 3 sections in there: the strike from Main Street, teachers and student arrests, and the children of strikers. And we're going to look at teacher and student arrests. So this is one of the pages we look at. Exhibits are not a huge part of what we do. We have been able to do some really cool exhibits because the Labor Archives has shared this material with us, and oftentimes even shared the prints, so we could reuse an exhibit they'd had that we normally wouldn't have the capacity to put up. But what I'm doing day to day is more classroom instruction, whether students are coming into the library or I am visiting their class. And these are GE courses for transfer or career education for community college students. So classes, ethnic studies, sociology, history, English. And they're big kind of general survey courses, American history, 1920 to present. So they have a lot to cover. We're not going to spend a ton of time on this. They might have a day or a week. And we are looking at the sources together. So one of them is, I'm in the classroom with the instructor, and this is a really popular one with students, which is why I selected it. And I'm just going to read the description. Delia Mendez was a social science teacher at Watsonville High School. The interview below, she describes accompanying her students when they went to the picket line to support their striking parents. Mendez and her students were arrested and charged by the Watsonville Police Department. She describes the arrests, the community response, and the trial. The letter is from the local teachers union, Pajaro Valley Federation of Teachers, Local 1936. It discusses Mendez's arrest, the charges against her, and asks for support in the form of letters and donations to a legal fund. And then we have a couple questions below. So we might listen to the audio and then read over the document. Just listening to the audio is kind of an experience because we ask students to, put everything away, maybe close your eyes and just listen. We're not going to do this one, Tanya, but we'll do that. We'll do it with the next page.
Okay.
And then again, kind of seeing the community organizations that are involved. And this one we'll do later. So let's stay back on the other page. Thanks. So, as I said, students they may never have worked with primary sources before, so we're spending some time just listening and then reading through and close reading the documents. And then oftentimes they'll be generating questions. So some of the things we've talked about with these two materials are kind of protest and police response, and then kind of the ripple effect of that. Does that make people want to get more involved or less involved? Are people more emboldened and upset, or are they more afraid to protest? What is the role of a teacher in supporting their students when something like this is happening in the community? What's appropriate for a teacher? This teacher almost got fired because of what happened. But then a lot of people kind of rose to her support. So it generates a lot of interesting questions with students many of whom went to Watsonville High School and had family members that were in the strike and are familiar with kind of all the circumstances and locations being described. And of course, relating it to our contemporary situation. So I'm going to pass it on to Alex now, who'll talk a little bit about working with students in the classroom. In the gallery.
In the gallery. Thank you, Michelle. Yes, so I'm going to talk about how we use the gallery exhibit in our primary source instruction sessions. And first, I do have to thank Tanya and Michelle for coming up with this content and curating such an incredibly rich teaching tool that contains so many different formats and examples of primary sources. And before I start talking about how the exhibit is organized, I just, piggybacking on what Michelle was saying, we do get a lot of class requests, a lot of different departments across college. So a lot of the departments under the umbrella of the College of Ethnic Studies, so Latino Studies programs. We have a lot of requests coming from communications and history department. And a lot of these are for sort of generic primary source instruction sessions where students are required to use primary sources in their research papers, and they've never done that before, maybe. So that's what a lot of our sessions are about, introducing them to what primary sources are and how to use them in their research. So again, this is a really, really rich teaching tool. The exhibit is organized in about 5 sections, and the first 4, kind of similar to the Canvas module, is sort of what Tanya describes as the 4 pillars of a successful strike. And within each of those pillars, those sections, there's clusters of material, and each cluster tells a little different part of that story. The first section is the strength, so holding the line. And then we have the solidarity section, which Michelle was showing you about sort of the union solidarity. Again, the community section where it's got the support from the community. And then the fourth pillar is telling the story. And then the exhibit wraps up with the victory section. And what's really great about this whole structure, this sequence, is the use of so many different types of materials. And this really enforces what we try to teach in our primary source sessions. And that's that you have to explore a lot of different perspectives, and that all those perspectives are found in these different types of materials, that you can't just rely on one single source or one single piece of evidence. And I think seeing all these sources working together in the exhibit like this really helps students understand the importance of preserving these materials and having archives. You'll notice on this slide we have this really fantastic image. So this is how we sort of start our sessions off in the gallery. This is the first image that you see when you walk in. It's enlarged, it's gigantic, it's immediately to the left. And most of the students don't have a lot of context around what the exhibit is about. So we start the session off by just asking them to look at the picture and just immediately what their first impressions are. And it's really amazing because we start talking about sort of what exactly they see, who they don't see in this picture. And this really sets the tone for the entire session in the exhibit. And it's amazing, without knowing much about the exhibit, the students are already identifying, oh, it's all women in this photo. And then they start identifying things like the age. They start talking about what's on the posters. They start talking about what is surrounding the women, like where they are, what time of year it is, possibly based on what they're wearing. And so it's sort of amazing to see them looking at a photograph in this way, and talking about it in ways that they haven't looked at before. And then we move along throughout the exhibit, taking one cluster, one type of source from each section, and evaluating it like that. And if you want to move on to the next slide, I have another example of an exercise that we do in the exhibit. Like Michelle was talking about, this is another one that really piques students' interest. So this is a flyer. This is in the strength section of the exhibit. So the strength of the workers, the holding the line. And this is related to scabs. And before I have the students read the text. This is the label that sits next to that, because the flyers are in Spanish, and then we have it translated on the label here. So I just first immediately ask them what a scab is. And a lot of times these students don't know yet what a scab is. And then I have a student read the text. And so I'll just read the first couple of lines for you all. And it's: the scab breaks strikes. Wherever the scab walks, men turn their backs, little angels cry, and the devil hides. No man has the right to break a strike while there is enough water to drown him or a rope long enough to hang him. Students really respond to this, as you can imagine. And it's a great example to start talking about the importance of flyers, disseminating information to a community. And what's really great about using this example is inevitably it always comes back to how today the students are receiving information, and then it gets them thinking about the primary sources that they're creating in their daily lives as well. Like what is the modern equivalent of a flyer? How are they getting information? In this exercise, we have the opportunity to talk about the effectiveness of images, how language is used in this context. We talk about like Catholic imagery and the role that that plays, given that the community is primarily Mexican and Mexican American workers. And so, like I said earlier, the rest of the session usually involves walking around the exhibit, selecting another item to do a deep dive into. We have QR codes under some of the images where students can actually listen to the recordings. Michelle showed you that example, and I think we're going to play one so they can talk about the role of oral history. We talk about news in the telling the story section. We talk about how newspapers are reporting the events in multiple newspapers. So there's opportunity to talk about the importance of multiple perspectives in reporting. So again, we're just reinforcing the importance of comparing and contrasting the different accounts and in order to get a complete picture. I would say that most of the students engaging with this material were obviously not aware that this event happened. Many of them had actually confessed that they grew up in this area and they just had no idea. So when students learn about an event by examining these types of materials, it helps just understanding how history gets told and whose history doesn't get told. And we talk a lot about that in these sessions, that they're so shocked to learn about this. And it leads to that conversation about whose history is, left out of the historic record. I'm happy to take questions. I can talk about this all day, but I think we have to move on to the next slide. Sorry, I probably went over.
No, that's okay, Alex. I think it's really helpful. I just want to move on because we're going to move to the next module and exhibit, which is about the Braceto program in California in particular. So those of you who may not be familiar with that program, it was an international agreement that contracted 5 million guest workers from Mexico to work seasonally in the United States. And as non-citizen workers, as you can imagine, they were subject to exploitative and dangerous conditions. Many of them were even unpaid and unhoused, and were housed in awful conditions. And they were exposed to pesticides such as DDT during their initial processing and in the fields. So despite these challenging conditions, men in the program built solidarity and community in the labor camps and organized to protest their working conditions despite threats of deportation. And also at the same time, sort of concurrently, organizations such as the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee, AWOC, called out the injustice of the program and worked to organize rank and file farm workers. And for those of you who may be interested, the translation of the sign in the image is we ask only for our rights. So the Canvas module was built, as I said earlier, from an exhibit curated by Leah Silva. She had done this incredible job of curating a show that incorporated all sorts of materials that were taken from the collection of Henry Anderson, who had started as a researcher looking at the program itself and then focused really on the health concerns of the Bracetos, but then eventually moved into farm working more broadly and became an organizer himself. So the module creates an overview of the program using primary sources such as photographs, maps, flyers, and pamphlets. And it covers the topics of migratory farm labor, becoming a Braceto, life in the program, and also goes into Filipino migrant agricultural workers and the beginnings of the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee. So here we have Michelle, sorry.
No, that's okay. Thanks, Tanya. So as I think we mentioned, many people in our local community of Santa Cruz County and Watsonville have family connections to the cannery strike, and an even larger number have connections to the Braceto program. Many of the people that worked in the canneries, they themselves or their parents came as Bracetos, and the cannery work represented a more stable, less migrant job with benefits and a union and a pension. So many people in our local community, students, staff at the library, people in the community have connections to the program. But for many of them, as Alex mentioned, it's kind of a distant, something they know about, but they don't have a lot of information about. And again, I'm just going to read the overview of this particular page, which is looking at working conditions. Agricultural laborers worked in the fields, orchards, packing sheds, and processing plants, producing food to sustain a domestic population. The specialization of labor created different classes of workers who performed specific tasks over and over. Stoop labor, illustrated in the photograph below, involved bending to the ground to harvest crops such as potatoes or strawberries. So this is a really powerful connection for our students because the strawberry industry is still huge in Santa Cruz County and Salinas, and many students themselves or their parents have worked in the fields picking berries. This is physically demanding work that took a toll on the body, making the jobs less desirable. The specialization of farm labor and the condition of precarity that all migrant farm workers faced created a state of competition between workers. Often the least protected class of workers, those without citizenship, ended up performing stoop labor and other less desirable jobs. So this exhibit ended up being even more relevant and timely than we expected, opening up in January here at Cabrillo. It had been previous year at San Francisco State. And it really helped us kind of helped students have a context for the role of immigrants in our economy, in our community, in our food system. And as Alex said, having these different documents and kind of close reading them and putting them together was really kind of changed the way they thought about current discussions about immigrants and immigrant labor, and people's ability to kind of speak out and ask questions and ask for things about their working conditions. The systems that we all depend on for our food and many other services. And just kind of how things have changed and how things have stayed the same. And I'll pass it on to Alex.
Thank you. Because you covered a lot of what I would have covered, and I'm going to talk about the exhibit in terms of sort of how it attracted different departments that we hadn't previously worked with before, and some of the new exercises we did in our primary source sessions with those departments. So again, this is just another opportunity allowing students to directly engage with original historic documents. I used a similar structure in the Bracero exhibit as I did in the Watsonville, walking through the exhibit, encouraging students to analyze an item from each section of the exhibit. But this time around, I was working with departments, as I mentioned, that I had never worked with before. One example was a business management class, and their focus was on policy making. And they came in for a session during the week that they were looking at farm workers in California. They didn't have a writing assignment requirement for this course. It wasn't about like getting students to use primary sources in their research. However, the professor really wanted his students to understand the importance of like how primary sources play in because of a role play simulation that they were doing in the class, which I wish I had been a fly on the wall for. It was a role playing simulation of the growers versus like the farm laborers, and so it was important for for his students, to understand some of the points of views and all the different experiences of the Proceros and sort of how they were also being talked about through some of the media. So we really focused on having the students selecting an item and describe it for themselves. And then as part of that sort of getting into role-playing mode, they had to then present in our session to the whole class how different people might interpret their own description of the item. I know it sounds very complicated, but it actually worked. And it was really surprising to do like a new activity like that, something I had never done before. So I had this opportunity to create a bunch of new exercises for classes. And similarly, we've had a biology class come in, and it was all about how looking at ways in which humans and ecosystems interacted. And they were also focusing that week, they happened to be focusing on California's Central Valley and sort of the historical and sociological side of farm workers. So again, we started in the gallery. We talked about the impact. We really focused on those images of like the stoop labor that Michelle was talking about. We looked at the pesticides. We looked at sort of as the Braceros, the farm workers were coming into the country, what was happening to them. So basically keeping, looking at sort of the impact on the humans on that side. So these are just some new, and again, the overall theme that just kept coming up over and over again was the sort of the students' reaction to this content. And one thing I have to say is there were students, a lot of students had family members who were Braceros, and they never really learned that history through their family. And if they did know that their family was were Braceros, they didn't understand the hardships. And it wasn't until they were exposed to these materials that they actually got a sense of what their family members had gone through. And yeah, that covers my section. I've probably been talking too long. Next slide.
That's okay. We're at the discussion and questions section, so I
Oh, great.
appreciate
Okay.
it. Yeah, I do want to sort of underline what Alex was saying about students coming into the exhibit and just finding themselves in that show, their own family history. We had one student come in and said, "Oh my God, all these women from the Watsonville strike were my neighbors growing up, and I had no idea that they would ever be important enough to have an exhibit about." And I was like, yeah, not only do they have an exhibit, they have a module, they have this film. There's actually a film that's being projected. So I think that they're all very proud and happy to see their community represented so predominantly, so prominently in the reading room. So we're going to switch gears a little. We're going to sort of put you all on the spot to think of some questions if you have any. I have a few warm-up questions just to get us started. My first question is for both Alex and Michelle. Maybe we'll start with Michelle since Alex just talked, but how does primary source instruction differ between community colleges and universities?
Well, I think one thing is, Alex was saying how, some students have an assignment where they have to use a primary source, and they might be in a lower or upper division course. And for us, oftentimes, I think the expectation is that community college students would not use primary sources or work with original documents or do original research. So we're kind of bringing that into these general education courses. And many have never done a research paper or have never worked with primary sources. And they might be, a student in a radiologic technology program. So they're not necessarily interested, but they have to take a GE course in sociology or writing. And it just really changes, I feel like, the way they think about research, kind of demystifying how history is constructed, how narratives are created, and helping, well, I'll talk about it more a little later, but kind of thinking about the expertise that they bring to these topics. And so it's been really, students have they're much more interested in engaging in the research with these sources that speak to them than they often are with kind of more generic research papers about, let's say, is immigration good or bad?
Yeah, Michelle, I think you kind of covered a lot of that. So I'll just reiterate that, like I had mentioned earlier, most of the sessions we're doing are because there is a primary source requirement for a paper, or it's an actual class, a graduate writing requirement class where it's their research methods class for their major. So we see a lot of those students coming in. It's totally an added bonus if the themes of the class happen to relate to the content of the exhibit, like the business class, like the plant ecology class, for example, where that week they were actually focusing on that type of content. So I would say the biggest difference, in my opinion, obviously requiring using primary sources in the research paper, but also they're learning how to conduct research in these types of classes. They're learning not only how the difference between primary and secondary sources, they're learning how to evaluate them, and they're learning how to find them. So we cover a lot of those topics in these classes as well. Like, what are archives? How do you access them? How do you navigate like archival finding aids, for example? How do you find them? How do you use them in your research? So that, just adding to what Michelle was already saying about her feelings on the differences. And just being able to, in our case, because we have these materials, students are able to hold them and look at them and talk about them, which I think is obviously very different as well than relying on the digitized versions in the Canvas modules, and helps them connect to that history, just looking at it in person.
Thanks, Alex. Michelle, there's something in the chat that I think maybe is related. It's about
Mhm.
K through 12. I'm wondering if you can address that question.
Yeah, I mean, it would be interesting to see how this works at San Francisco State versus Santa Cruz, but Santa Cruz is a pretty small community, Santa Cruz County, which includes Watsonville and a few other cities. So I know most of the people that work at the local high schools. A lot of their students come to Cabrillo. So I have shared the material with them, and there's been a lot of interest. They can't like integrate the Canvas modules in the same way because they don't use that system, but we created a public version of the modules that they can access and use for courses. And they have also come and looked at the exhibit. So it has definitely supported social science, English, AP, IB classes at the local high schools. And I think one thing I will say also, again, I talked about how sometimes this is just one day or one week. And so that really informed how we describe the sources, because I think sometimes as librarians, we feel like we should cover everything and have all the footnotes and all the information, answer all the questions. But in this case, in my experience, we really just needed a very short paragraph that provided some context, a couple of questions that are a way into the source, and then maybe 1, 2, 3 sources that students can spend some time with. And it was important to kind of not overload, to make it accessible for students and usable for teachers that have to cover a lot of ground.
There's also, I should have mentioned, for Fields of Struggle, there is an online exhibit available too. And we hope to do an online exhibit, publicly available version for the Watsonville Cannery Strike. So there's all kinds of formats where people can interact with the content, and all the content that was digitized, at least for the Bracero program, is available in our digital asset management system as well. So it has transcription, and they're able to watch the videos and everything with accessibility as well. So I'm just gonna move to
Can I add one more thing, Tanya?
Sure, sure. I was gonna put a link to the.
Yes, please. We talked at the beginning about how one of the reasons we did this was supporting curriculum on our campus. And one big thing that has happened in California over the last few years is there's a new ethnic studies requirement. And that is in California high schools, community colleges, and the CSU system. So where we work. So there's this new GE requirement, there's new classes, there's new teachers. So in both the high school and the college and university setting, these modules provide materials for teachers that are building that new curriculum.
Right. I'll grab that link later. I'm not able to, since I'm sharing and doing everything else. I do have a question. I just wondered, Alex, so you mentioned a little bit that you are getting all kinds of classes that are coming in, and of course they are not coming specifically to talk about the Watsonville Cannery Strike or the Preserve program. So I'm wondering how, when you get a request for generic primary source instruction, how you can incorporate the exhibit into your instruction, even though it's not related directly.
Yeah, that's a great question. And something I forgot to touch on earlier was how because of this exhibit and the requests coming in, we're slowly being able to move away from this like one-shot model. So we're able to do multiple sessions and students are starting to return to the unit. So one way I would address that, we could still use the exhibit because, like I said, it is this rich teaching tool full of lots of different examples. And even if it has nothing to do with the content of their class, it still introduces them to a lot of the different formats and how they all work together to tell the story. And that's one way. But another thing I've been seeing a lot of and we've been doing is where we're starting in the gallery to get an idea, learning about the primary sources, learning about the different formats and how to use them, and then taking it outside of the gallery where we'll either do the second half of a session or an entirely different session on a different topic and applying what they're learning. You know, a lot of these classes are coming in for labor archives materials specifically. So they're already interested in strikes and activism and protests. So we're applying what they learned in the Watsonville exhibit, you know, applying those pillars of a successful strike to maybe another strike or another historic event. One thing I can think of off the top of my head is one I did recently where it was a Latina studies class and it was on, it was actually like a the women in performance. So they were looking at the Watsonville Cannery strikes, and then they were applying the four pillars of a successful strike to the SF State students-led strike of 68, 69. So I worked in advance with the faculty member to pull a bunch of collections that might answer some of the similar questions, like how were the students sort of holding the line, and like in that strength section, for examples, what were the students up against? Who were they working with? Who was supporting them? What organizations? Kind of like the solidarity section. How was the strike being reported? How was the story being told? So they were applying all of Tanya's pillars of the successful strike to another strike. And we've actually done it a few different times in different sessions. That same business administrative professor who brought his class in for the Braceros also brought them into the Watsonville Cannery Strike exhibit. So then they could apply that same structure as they were watching a documentary on the immigrant workers, like the Freedom Ride documentary. So he was asking the same questions, like what were they up against during this ride? What, you know, who was supporting them? So that's sort of how we can take that same format from the exhibit and apply it to other events or other strikes or more generic, yeah, more generic instruction sessions. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, it's helpful. I see that Michael has his hands up.
Hi. I'm wondering
Hi, it's good to see you.
yeah, good to see you too. I'm wondering if Alex, if there's, I want to build on the question that, you know, the kind of, uh, if I understand correctly, there were moments when classes came in more than once to view the same documents, right? So I mean, you were touching on how they applied ideas from one context to another, but I'm kind of curious about what a multiple session type of instructional, you know, scaffolded type of process looked like. You know, what sorts of, did you reapproach the same documents? Did you, you know, have different sets of documents with, you know, with different, you know, different layers of reading or what have you? I'm just curious about more of that.
Yes, great question. So yes, it started one session in the exhibit where we went through all of, you know, what I had talked about previously. And then the faculty member scheduled a second session with her students, and this is where they were going to be focusing on the student-led strike. But I actually worked with that faculty member. She kind of sent me some ideas on what she thought the students were going to ask. And because the student-led strike collection is massive, it's hundreds of boxes, I sort of pre-selected materials that I thought would support their research questions once they were in. And so when we did that second session, we talked about the student newspapers. I introduced them to the finding aid for that collection, pre-highlighting the boxes that I had pulled for them just to give them a little, and there were some great descriptions in that finding aid of those boxes so they could see what was in it. And then they spent time in that session going through the material, sort of learning how to pull different documents that would answer those questions. And so it was half that second session was sort of half like lecture, half workshopping with the material. And then the third part of that was the students making appointments, coming in and using the same boxes that I had pulled in advance. And of course, during that second session, they were telling me what else they were interested in. And I was running back and forth and based on my knowledge of the collection, getting the materials that I thought would support their questions. I hope that answered it.
No, that is really helpful. I'm interested in particular in the level of kind of curating that is sort of done in the moment of instruction versus over curating,
Yeah.
those sorts of processes. So,
You really have to do
helpful.
a little curating in the
Of
beginning,
course,
but
right.
then once they're introduced to the finding aid, once they're introduced to all the access points, then they're able to kind of take the lead themselves and then
Yeah.
request boxes on that third session, if they're not already using. And it's not the first time we've done this. Now, this is like this semester we've done a lot of these repeat visits where they tell me in advance what they're interested in, and we, pull the materials and they can workshop it with me.
I think you've outlined a clear structure that I think really makes a lot of sense. So I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Michelle, I was going to ask you one question, but we have 5 minutes left. But I'm wondering if you can walk us through how you teach the primary source modules in the classroom. Let me know if you need me to share something else.
Yeah, maybe you could share that page, and I'm just going to talk a little bit, and I'll start by maybe answering Michael's question from my perspective. We will oftentimes have multiple sessions, and we're spending a lot of time slowing way down and spending like a whole hour with one source and talking about it. And you really start slow, and then students start to get into it. And then when we do the follow-up, we might have students just pick a source and look at it on their own and then talk about it. So the first one would be we're working together in a group to read it. The second session, they would be picking something on their own and answering some questions. And the third session, because I don't have an archive, they're not doing further research in the archive necessarily. They're thinking of their research questions and looking for secondary sources. And that really helps them think about the nature of research and primary and secondary sources. And again, it brings in that even developing their own research question makes them feel really empowered in the process, because they're like, what do I care about? What do I want to learn more about? What kind of knowledge do I bring to this topic? How does this relate to what's happening in my community right now? So this page is on Children of Strikers. And the first page is an image from a newspaper. I'm going to skip down a little bit. I would love to talk about all of these, but we don't have much time. So will you scroll through, Tanya, and then we'll listen to the audio. The first is the audio. This is basically an education program 3 months into the strike that teachers put on at the local high school, because this had a huge impact on, because a lot of kids had to drop out of school and start working as their parents weren't working. So a lot of teachers were very involved because they were seeing the impact. And then if you go down a little further, there's a newspaper article about that program at the high school that you just saw. And it features one of the students who was arrested during the strike, this student, Maribel Medina, who is also the president of her class. So it was a big deal for her. And both her parents were strikers. So let's go up and just listen to the audio. And like I said, just the process of like, put everything away, don't take any notes, just listen, is very powerful for students.
All right, let's hope that it works.
I don't hear it, Tanya.
Yeah, I can hear it, but I guess you all can't.
Damn. This happens to me every
Darn.
time I try to play audio.
I'm not sure if
So-
somebody didn't give me permission, I guess.
So, you actually, will you share this link in the chat? So this is a public link, so not right now, but in your own time, feel free to open it up and listen to the audio yourself. And I'm just going to describe it. This woman is Fidelia Carrizosa. She's a striker. And the interview is her, this guy named Peter Shapiro, who's a labor historian, but her daughter is also there translating. And so she's talking about the experience of taking her kid to the picket line, and the things she saw at the picket line. And there's a bunch of kind of funny exchanges because she's talking about how, on the one hand, it was like very positive to have her kid there. On the other hand, her kid maybe saw fights between people. She talks about people getting spit on in the face. She said, like, you know, it really wasn't a place for children. And she regrets taking her. She talks about her husband saying, well, if you're going to go and do all this political stuff, don't leave the kids at home. You got to take them. So that was part of the experience, and the women supporting each other on the picket line. She talks about her 5-year-old making herself a little pretend sign and like stomping around the house saying, yes, strike, down with the police, and her neighbors complaining about it. And then the last thing she talks about is, well, she's talking about maybe the negative impact on her daughter. Her daughter says, no way, this was really positive for me. I learned so much and I felt safe because I was there with you and I was there with other women in the community, and it really influenced who I am. So it's really powerful for students to listen to, and there's a lot in there, and it's only 2 minutes. And then students can kind of take it the direction that they want to. So a lot of them are really interested in like kind of who gets to protest. Do you get to protest if you're like a working single mom? And just how powerful these women are, and what impact they had on the local community, despite not having access to a lot of resources. So, like I said, listen to it on your own if you have a chance. And I'll stop.
We're at time, but I'm going to leave us. Maybe what I'll do is just forward to some feedback that we received about. This one is actually, Alex, do you want to address the faculty feedback?
Sure. Obviously, we had great feedback from faculty. We mentioned earlier, we were like the departments we noticed engaging with the materials, art history, business, English, ethnic studies, history, my biology, plant ecology class. We've seen political science classes, sociology and communication, as well as our local faculty unions. Faculty were able to use the exhibit to talk about other topics and explore the larger themes of the course. I gave some examples of that. Faculty felt that working with primary sources helped students to demystify the research process, clarifying how scholars use sources as evidence and create narratives. And faculty also remarked that many students felt a personal connection to the content. So seeing the original sources helped them feel empowered to take ownership of their research, learning, and history.
So we have a quote here. Michelle, did you want to read this one?
Sure. This is a faculty member, I believe. It's very powerful. So they will have this seed deeply planted inside them so that they can see the power of the people. I have family that were farm workers. I have family that were here in California and decided to leave because they were mistreated, because they were deported through Operation Wetback.
I can read this one, Tanya.
Okay.
This is from one of Michelle's English students. I think this archive is important because it humanizes the people in the stories. When learning about history, we often forget that these are or were real people who lived these lives, and it's hard to find an emotional attachment. With archives like this, with photos and personal details, there's more of an emotional aspect.
And I'll finish with this one. Because my parents were immigrant field workers, I have a personal experience regarding discriminatory events. It's not fair for their history to be forgotten since they played a major role in the development of this community. It's important to research and document history since it helps give those who were not there in person a piece of that history, and it helps preserve it for longer. And that's another one of Michelle's students in English 1A. Alex, do you want to read this one from
Oh,
the
sure.
first?
Yeah, another SFSU student. When times got really hard, they were able to make a stand and not falter no matter what. You see them striking for what? Months at a time, up to 10 months. They weren't making money. They weren't doing their jobs. They were just surviving, and they stood tall. This was in response to the Watsonville exhibit, I believe.
Great. Thank you all for coming and staying a little late. Here's our contact information. Happy to stay a little longer if we have questions, but I know that everybody's got a full schedule today. So thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks.
This was fascinating. I'm from the East Coast, so even though I'm old enough to have remembered it, I really have only vague memories of it. So, but thank you very much.
Yeah, it was good to have you all here. It's good to see you, Michael.
Yeah, nice to see you too. I'm gonna hop out, I think.
Okay, see you all later.
I have a bunch of questions, but I'm just gonna.
Oh, you do?
Yeah,
Okay.
Michael, if you want to
Yeah.
talk more about like
Yeah.
scaffolding and like just email me because I
Yeah,
have lots of thoughts and we've
I
done other
will.
things too. But
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, I'm always interested in the moving beyond the one shot type of situation in all types of contexts, just because I think, I mean, you know, at my current institution, I'm teaching a credit bearing course now, or I will be too. So it's like I'm always moving in that direction in one way or another, so it's just always interesting to me to hear exactly how that scaffolding works, especially in the primary source type context. So in any case, yeah, happy to.
likewise.
Yeah.
You can
Yeah.
borrow our Canvas modules.
Yes.
They're up in the Commons,
Yes,
and they're
yes.
freely available. So
I would love to do that. So,
yeah.
yeah.
All right.
All right.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.